Welcome to the Disabuse Podcast, where we seek to prevent, detect, investigate, and eliminate abuse in churches and faith-based organizations. Today, we are joined by Peter Schuurman. Dr. Schuurman is the Executive Director of Global Scholars Canada and an adjunct professor at Redeemer University, where he has taught since 2008. He has his PhD as well in religious studies from the University of Waterloo. Now, he's here to talk to us today about two of his books. His 2019 book, The Subversive Evangelical, The Ironic Charisma of an Irreligious Megachurch, and his most recent book, co-authored with Angela Beck, Blessed Are the Undone, Testimonies of the Quiet Deconstruction of Faith in Canada. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, I'd like to start by talking about a little bit about Blessed Are the Undone and kind of back in through there to the earlier book as well. So this book is on deconstruction of faith in a Canadian context. First of all, before we talk about the theme I want to focus on, which is the role that abuse and sort of abusive theology can play in deconstruction, could you give us a starting point to understand what it is to be undone and what is deconstruction?
Yeah, our definition of deconstruction is more sociological. It has, of course, a philosophical lineage, but this is a word that people are using on the internet to describe the dismantling of their faith. And they may not have ever read Jacques Derrida. Probably most of them have not, but this is how we said, we call it being faith undone. Having your conservative or evangelical affiliation with God, the Bible, and the Christian faith fall apart, usually prompted by the failures of the church, while simultaneously being emotionally and spiritually distanced from a taken for granted religious family, community, and tradition. And we see it both happening on an individual level and on an institutional level, the deconstruction of faith and becoming undone.
Now, there are several factors you identify with deconstruction as catalysts for it. And the ones that interest me and I want to focus on for our purposes here, although the book has many fascinating topics, but the one I want to focus on is the role of abuse and abusive theology. Now, you start the book with the story of Emily, who refers to her own deconstruction in the church being catalyzed by the observation of clergy sexual abuse. And then later on, there are a couple chapters that I want to talk about. And the first one is on purity culture. That's chapter 13. So what is purity culture?
Well, purity culture is a term that was given to a sociological shift in evangelicalism, where in response to the sexual revolution, they sought to socialize their young in a faith-filled life of sexual purity, which means mostly refraining from certain activities, and most specifically sexual activities. And one of the primary influences in that movement was a book written by Joshua Harris called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And the kind of pun in the title is that, you know, there's a lot of rules for courtship, and a lot of them have to do with not touching or kissing somebody until you're married. And it carried a deeply dualistic understanding of human identity, where the body and arousal and sexuality were dangerous, and spirituality and church and prayer didn't come with liabilities in the same way. And they were pitted against each other. And that created a lot of problems.
I was impacted in that chapter where you and Angela observed that, quote, none of the men we spoke with, and I should say that, so in the book, you interviewed 28 people to understand their own process of deconstruction, and you did that over a couple of years, but you said none of the men we spoke with named purity culture as part of their deconstruction, but fully half of the women we interviewed identified purity culture as part of the inheritance of faith that needed deconstructing. why is it that purity culture, or in what ways did it uniquely impact women in a negative way?
Well, first of all, a double standard. So males were seen to be kind of sexual animals who could not control themselves. And then so the impetus for sexual purity was put on the women. And so there's a sense of responsibility that is unequally distributed in a dating relationship through these teachings. Secondly, and we've heard this different analogies here, Velcro, chewing gum, passing around a rose. I think an Oreo cookie was used as well. But somehow the teaching is that something is used again and again and again, like chewing gum, and you get it at the end of the process, and it's lost its flavor, and it's somehow gross, right? And then that was translated. Usually it'd be a mixed audience, but they'd say, is that how you want to be known on the marketplace of the dating marketplace, as somebody who's been used a number of times? And then you can imagine the women in the room, because that's who it's being addressed to, who have lost their virginity or had multiple boyfriends and kissed them, and the deep sense of shame that they carry because of these teachings.
Is it fair to say that this kind of teaching in a church, if there is, for example, an instance of clergy sexual abuse of a male clergy exploiting a position of power to sexually abuse a female, that this would place that female at a greater disadvantage if she's in a church with a purity culture?
Well, the story you started with the person we call Emily, she was explicitly told, you never question a man of God. So you got the purity culture happening in one sense, but then the teaching that this is God's man doing God's work in God's house with God's people. And you've set it yourself up for and you teach the submission of women, and we're getting out of purity culture here, but you teach about male headship and other things, and this works together to create an environment in which abuse can be facilitated. And now I just want to say for the record that abuse happens in liberal churches, progressive churches, conservative churches, Orthodox, Catholic. It happens in doctors' offices. It happens in lawyers' offices. It happens on sports teams, but there is something about the purity culture and the teaching of male headship that does set things up for trouble.
So even setting aside the question of, for example, whether complementarian male headship theology is correct or not, recognizing that its truth is independent of the risk it might pose. So it could be true, but it could still present a risk of abuse if it is exploited in a particular way. Okay.
Yeah.
It's also a chapter there on pulpit crimes. You identify a few different individuals, Ravi, Zacharias, Bruxy, Cavey, for example. We're going to talk more about Bruxy in a moment, because that's going to bring us back into the Subversive Evangelical, your other book. But maybe just talk about Ravi Zacharias for a moment. So who was he, who, because he did pass away as well, so I use the past tense. And how did that impact you? Because you certainly knew who he was. How did it impact you when we learned what we did learn about him?
Well, Ravi grew up in India, and then he immigrated to Canada. Right down, he went to Tyndale University in Toronto, and I lived half a kilometer from Tyndale, and I took guitar lessons at Tyndale, and so Ravi was kind of a local hero for us. And I've heard him speak numerous times, and you know what? I do have an affinity for apologetics, and he was a worldwide known apologist, right? And he had offices around the world. I forget how many people he employed, but it was dozens and dozens of people. And he was really good. And he had a persona that was earnest and that fostered trust so well. And I was actually reading his biography. I think it's From East to West. to my son at the time. I was almost done when the news broke that an independent investigation had determined that he had committed acts of sexual misconduct. And I was devastated. I was heartbroken. And for other reasons, where this had happened in other places in my life around the same time, made it doubly disillusioning.
I can imagine like how many people converted to Christianity through the ministry of Ravi Zacharias, and the impact it would have been for them to say the person who was the catalyst for my conversion himself was a sexual predator. It's easy to see how people that could easily become a catalyst for them deconstructing the faith, insofar as the very legitimacy of that faith was tied to the person who had led them into it.
Yeah.
Right.
And some people say, well, my faith was always in Jesus. And so I know people are sinners, and I wasn't surprised. But you know what? If you had an emotional bond with somebody who led you deeper into your faith in Jesus, and who you trusted as somebody who carried the face of Jesus for you, finding out that not just that they've committed a sin, and in some cases it's multiple women, and sometimes, often, it's the deceit that's layered on top of the sin, and then the disciplining and silencing of the women in the process, that makes it so much worse.
Yeah, I think so often churches and other faith-based communities that they have a very short-term perspective, that they want to control the messaging, they want to protect their reputation short term, but the truth wills out eventually. And when it does, the impact is just magnified on the credibility or lack of credibility of the church. The way that you respond to a crisis situation is really going to show your mettle as a faith community, I would say. Well, that brings us to Bruxy and to the meeting house. You certainly talk about him in the chapter in Blessed Are the Undone, but you had a whole book on him earlier. So I want to introduce Bruxy like this, that you have a couple descriptions, Mennonites with electric guitars, and then this anecdote, which I think kind of captures something about Bruxy. Maybe you could unpack who he is based on this anecdote, that he had a tattoo on his arm, or has a tattoo of Leviticus 19:28 that says, refers to you shall not tattoo yourselves. So who was Bruxy with the faith of Jesus, and he said the body of a Buddha? Who was this character who for a while loomed large in Canadian evangelical life?
When I started my PhD, I wanted to study the nexus of humor and religion. And my supervisor said, that's too abstract. You got to find something that embodies that, and then you can go at that wider topic. And Bruxy Cavey was funny. Like, there's something deeply ironic about that tattoo, right? Irony. He was a master of irony. And what's the motto of the meeting house? The church for people who are not into church. It's irony upon irony. And that's why my subtitle is The Ironic Charisma of an Irreligious Megachurch. Because his whole shtick was how Jesus was an irreligious savior. And so he's having fun pointing out that faith in Jesus is something that goes beyond the religion of the Pharisees and not the tax collectors, the Pharisees and legalism and the hard-nosed, judgmental, angry evangelicalism of the religious right that dominates the airwaves, even here in Canada. And my thesis was that in Canada, right-wing religion carries a stigma. It's not cool in Canada to be an evangelical. There's even some hostility towards people who bear the name of Jesus in a way that's evangelical. And so Cavey was a genius in terms of creating what I said was an evangelicalism for people not into evangelicalism. And his distancing of evangelical faith from religion, made it palatable to thousands upon thousands of Canadians. And he did it in a disarming, playful, ironic way.
At its peak, how large was the meeting house? And when you were doing your research and interviewing people, like what was the general response you got from people at the time before his fall from grace? What was the response you got from them as to what drew you to the meeting house?
Yeah, they were at about 5,500. I think I followed them through their peak, and they had almost up to 20 sites across Southern Ontario, meeting mostly in cinemas, movie theaters. And everyone I interviewed, pretty much. Some I think were in denial, but 99% of the people I interviewed said I came because of Bruxy. He's such a great teacher. I can listen to him for hours. It's 45-minute sermons, and I look at my watch and I think, oh boy, the time flew. I wish it wasn't over already. The testimonies I heard, one person said to me, I bumped into him after the sermon in the hallway, and I was so nervous. I thought, I'm in the presence of a God. So that's quite a statement there, right? That there's a sense that Bruxy is larger than life, and he's on these jumbotrons, right? So there's the technology of it, there's the numbers of people, there's the 3 services every Sunday morning in the main megachurch warehouse site, and it all makes him to be larger than human, superhuman. So that's how people saw him, and people would say Bruxy drew me to the meeting house, but it's a deep sense of community that have kept me here, and there's truth to that for sure. But the community that they're a part of is held together by a personality.
Hindsight's 2020, as they say. So looking back, it's easy to see with hindsight some of the problems and issues at the meeting house and Bruxy and so on. At the time that you were doing your research and interviewing people, were you seeing any red flags or matters of concern apart from obviously the degree to which a personality cult can really emerge in that kind of situation, but anything beyond that that you were kind of concerned about at the time?
Yeah, I wasn't looking for sexual, misconduct, so I wasn't asking questions that would have got me there. I was focusing on the power of charisma, and I was developing a model for how charisma works. And so the piece about this church is a little too dependent on one human being, that was pretty prominent in my mind. I also had some strong convictions about meeting in movie theaters, which are in malls, and the advertisements they had, which were playing on consumer religion. I said at some point, architecture always gets the last word. And when you meet in a mall, inside a movie theater, and that's the place where the celebrities, sort of parade, and where you're passively present in a cushioned seat with popcorn, you're tapping into one of the most powerful cultural scripts that we have in North America. And so that piece you'll find in my book carries some critique. But what unfolded afterwards totally devastated me and surprised me, because to some extent I based my reputation as a scholar on saying Bruxy Cavey is not like the other megachurch pastors. And it's not the main theme of my book, but it's a sub-theme to say that not all megachurch pastors are alike, and the stereotype of the sexually manipulative, fraudulent evangelist that we get from Sinclair's book Elmer Gantry already in the 1920s, which is carried through the decades and movies, is not what's happening at the meeting house. And so it was published by Secular Press, the Gill Queen's University Press, and I was saying to the secular audience, this man's different, so watch your stereotypes. And it's true, he still is not a right-wing, judgmental, politically active evangelical, but on the matter of sexual misconduct, he fell right into the stereotype, and it's devastating.
Tell me about that devastation, and particularly how that appeared in Blessed Are the Undone, again, the later book, where you're interviewing people who are talking about their own process of deconstruction. What role does the story of somebody like Bruxy have in the stories of deconstruction?
Yeah, it's quite prominent. And again, this is all random. Our sample's a random sample, but a lot of them knew Bruxy either through his, internet sermons or attended the meeting house at some point in their life. And so one story is I was in my church, it was COVID, and we had a verbally abusive pastor who was fighting with his board, and it was just acrimonious. And so we decided to leave, and then we found the meeting house, and it was a safe place to land. And here was somebody who understood, the sharp points of religion and how religion can go bad. And he talked about relationship and how wonderful a relationship can be when it's done in the mode of Jesus. And then when the announcement came, some people said, one analogy was it landed like a bomb in my life. Another woman said, I felt like I got hit by a baseball bat, because this was supposed to be the safe place. This was my last chance church, right? And the last chance church fell out from under me. And it's because I trusted this guy, and in the end realized he had been deceiving us all for years about this one issue. Yeah. And at some point, I want to talk about his whole shtick of religion and relationship. And maybe, shall I launch into that now? So I have, one question people ask about sexually abusive males who are theologians or pastors is, can I read their stuff still? And what's the value? What do I have to do with the stuff that's in my brain even that I can't get rid of because it nurtured me and it's been bonded to me in a way? And I think one piece of advice is you need to think about it and you need to deconstruct it if there's something in it that doesn't align with what's true and good and beautiful about the Christian faith. And one of the biggest shticks of Bruxy's teaching was relationship, not religion. The meeting house is where we turn our chairs towards one another and share our lives together, and we don't do religion. His best-selling book was called The End of Religion. Or I think he told me that a previous title was going to be God Hates Religion. And they had a series entitled Wrecking Religion. Like the whole vision, the irreligious message of Jesus is what kept the meeting house so attractive to so many people. But let me say that pitting religion against relationship is a false dichotomy. It's a false teaching even. What he was really talking about is bad religion is not as good relationships. But when we see religion as boundaries and rules and requirements for how you behave, and relationship as a romantic sense of being connected to other people, you can see that you're also setting things up for the potential for abuse, because we need rules. Relationships need rules. Good relationships require rules in order for them to flourish. And to pit religion, and I know theologically what he was doing, he was saying legalism is wrong and good relationships that are loving are right, right? But it's an idiosyncratic way of understanding those two things. They're both cultural goods, religion and relationship. And he pit them against each other. And he's right. Like religion of rules and roles and rituals that we think is going to get us favor with God is called works righteousness. But you've idiosyncratically defined the word religion. And I would say to him, and relationships in which one person takes advantage of another person and creates a toxic environment in their workplace is wrong. So relationships and religion are both cultural goods that can go wrong, but we need both. And without religion, relationships become abusive. Religion, in the sense that I've defined it, as the rules and roles and rituals and boundaries that God commands in his law. Like I have this whole debate about law and love and how people pit them against each other. And they say, well, Jesus' greatest commandment was to love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. And I say, yeah, and it's a law. It's a commandment. Don't pit God's laws against God's love. They're both from the same source.
Yeah, so just to unpack and wrap up some of that from
Yeah.
my perspective, I think Bruxy, certainly he was tapping into people like Karl Barth, for example, in his commentary on Romans, used the word religion for law in a very provocative way, like as something wholly negative. But
Yeah.
again, it was a rhetorical device, and it was meant
Yeah.
to shock people. But it's playing off an ambiguity between these two different meanings of religion. One is it's just a fundamental form of life in which one is oriented in a community to one's understanding of the divine, versus legalism, right? And if you're equivocating between those two, you can get into, if people are not clear, you can get into this trouble. So, for example, from my perspective, to unpack some of what you said, like a person could say, well, if we're a relationship, if we're a family, who needs like plan to protect to govern the interactions of a family? Because we're all family. We don't say, well, the father can't be alone with the daughter or something because plan to protect said this is not wise, but religion would have that. And I'm taking this maybe to a bit of an extreme, but you could get into the mindset where you downplay the need for appropriate strictures to protect vulnerable groups within a church community. And gosh, I mean, the kind of damage that could be brought about by a bad actor in that situation is a pretty disturbing thought. So I definitely see, as you're pointing out, that link there with abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So just a quick update, like where is the meeting house now in Bruxy? What is this kind of fallout since this became public like 3 years ago or so, is it?
Yeah, I think it was late 2021. And then, so what followed very briefly, and this is all covered by major newspapers in Canada and Christianity Today and the Religion News Service, is that Bruxy was eventually charged by the police with sexual assault. And there were 3 counts. The first one was, I think, the most significant one, and the other 2, I think, were related. And so he was arrested and then set out on bail. And then since then, we've been waiting for the trial, and COVID was on and off. And then his lawyer appealed this past summer to the judge, saying that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms stipulates the right to a speedy trial. And it's been 2 years, and the judge agreed. And so that case was withdrawn. So we don't know what the evidence was, what the story was, what the testimonies were, and we'll never hear them. And the other 2, the Crown said that there didn't seem to be enough evidence available to create a possible conviction. So those were also withdrawn. So right now, I wrote a short column on this called Closure Without Closure. It seems like the case is closed, but we don't know what the story is. And we don't have independent, a judge and jury and lawyers helping us understand the story and interrogate the story. Secondly, the most significant news is that the meeting house this past summer was unable to procure abuse liability insurance. And apparently they tried all across Canada, even farther abroad, and could not get abuse liability insurance. So they had to close their doors. And the bodies that were left, that were still worshiping together and doing church together, have found other entities to connect with that allow them to get the insurance they need to continue to operate. So as of December now, 2024, that's where we're at.
I guess a last question as we're beginning to wrap up. How does one look at, the latest story, someone who is supposed to be different, Bruxy? And as you said, in some ways he was different. In other ways, no, it's the same patterns of abuse, it looks like, that we've seen in other cases. How do you avoid being cynical?
Wow. Yeah, I think that's important. I think that's a really important question, because so this also happened to a very close colleague of mine, where he got caught in a sexual relationship with a student under his pastoral care. And so we have the Ravi, Zacharias situation, and there's more. And I think I have to battle against that cynicism. What is it that keeps me from becoming totally cynical? And I think it's people, pastors, theologians, who are all sinners, but who haven't gone down that route, who have stayed true to their wives, who have created boundaries and rules for themselves to prevent that sort of thing. And I think it's possible. I mean, they're sinners and they'll have other issues for sure, but they may not have this one. And I ask friends now, not regularly, but I say, I hope you're not doing anything, because I'm sick and tired of it. And maybe to turn not to cynicism, but to let your anger and disillusionment change the way you operate and the questions you ask and the kind of people you hire. Like, I'm sick and tired of these pastoral ads that say, looking for a dynamic, charismatic leader who can, increase the size of our church. So maybe to channel the disillusionment instead of to cynicism, but to a constructive critique of how we do church in North America. And that's the best of deconstruction, I think, right now, is that it leads to a reconstruction. And not that the reconstruction will never need to be deconstructed, but that we see it as an ongoing process of spiritual development that is entering into the death of Jesus and rising again with him to a new life that is possible on this side of heaven, given the Spirit's leading and our plan to protect kind of approach to relationships and to ministry.
Well said. Peter, I really want to thank you for talking on this really important topic. So again, the two books are The Subversive Evangelical and brand new is Blessed Are the Undone, co-authored with Angela. So thanks a lot, Peter.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Randall. Appreciate it.